Today from Paris, France, it's episode number 3 of the Word Outreach Podcast. Welcome to a place for encouragement in the Christian walk. My name is Rudy Vaughn, and today we're thinking about helping others to take the teachings of Christ seriously. A lot of people, of course, don't take Christ seriously at all, but there is something that we can do to help. We can introduce the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. And today we're going to begin looking at 3 kinds of evidence for the resurrection. And then I want to introduce you to my friends Ace and Betty Draper. They're missionaries with New Tribes Mission. And their story illustrates for us an important character quality that we all need to have if we want to be used by God.
I knew that God was preparing me for something. There was going to be a change in our life.
So some of our training early in a mission organization was actually living out in the woods for about 6 weeks and actually trying to experience what it was like to be alone.
And before we finish up today, you'll learn about the first kind of supporting evidence for the resurrection. It's the evidence that gets its facts from historical documents. Thank you for coming today. I am so glad you're here. Welcome to the Word Outreach Podcast. I enjoy watching a good illusionist. Someone who really knows what they're doing can redirect the attention of the audience, and they can cause the audience to focus on what's really not the most important thing, so that the illusionist can do his trick. And when it comes to considering Christianity, our enemy, the great deceiver, does his job well also. He knows how to distract people from what really matters. In Matthew chapter 12, verses 39 and 40, Jesus was speaking to the Pharisees, and he said, "There will be no sign for this generation except the sign of Jonah. Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights, and the Son of Man will be in the heart of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights." This is what was going to be most important, that Jesus rose from the dead. It's what proved his authority to the world. But the great illusionist would have people thinking that other things are more important. Well, I wanted to know what are the top reasons that people are rejecting Christianity. And so I went to the internet. And of course, there were pages and pages. I finally stopped writing the reasons down at number 27, but let me read a few of them for you. What I did is I combined the ones that were similar, and I came up with 14. These are 14 of the top reasons that people are rejecting Christianity. The first was intellectual doubts. This has to do with science, evidence of actual miracles, and the scientific possibility of miracles. And then, why would God allow suffering, general suffering and personal suffering? Some people talked about bad church experiences, including too many hypocrites in the church. Others said that Christians are too judgmental and intolerant. They think they're superior. Some say, "I'm just fine without God. I'm having too much fun living like I am." Others say the Bible can't be read objectively because you have to repent of sin first. The Bible is full of contradictions, some claim. It can't be the perfect Word of God. It was written by men. More people have been killed in the name of religion than any other cause. Some say Christianity is oppressive to women. Others say the Bible supports slavery. And what about all the people who have never heard the gospel? Will they go to hell? Some say I can't understand the Bible, and there's no proof that God's real. And finally, there are some people that claim other sources besides the Gospels do not mention Jesus. They claim that there are not any secular sources that mention Christ. And these are the 14 of the top reasons that people say they reject Christianity. Many people haven't had a conversation with someone about the resurrection or researched it on their own, and they have decided to evaluate Christianity like it's some kind of club. They're looking to see if its ideas match up with what they consider to be good, and if they like it, then maybe they'll join. Now, when I did my research on Google, I found 27 reasons before I stopped searching But it wasn't until number 25 that I came across the specific topic of the resurrection. It's the most important thing to be considering. It is what proves that Jesus was who he said he was. The resurrection proves his authority. It's what tells the world that we need to take what he said seriously. But while the resurrection is the most important topic, it didn't even make it to the top 10 list. People tend to think that so many other topics are more important, and they miss out on the one issue that really matters most. It reminds me of an illusionist. This is what the great deceiver has done. When people are considering whether or not they should take the teachings of Christ seriously, the great deceiver, the father of lies, has convinced people that the things that are least important are the most important. And now people are missing out on the new life that Christ offers. So I have a question. Who is going to redirect their focus? Who is going to help them to realize that there is something more important to consider? The book of Isaiah tells about a vision where Isaiah saw the Lord with angels above him, and the Lord asked this important question: Whom shall I send as a messenger to this people? Who will go for us? And in chapter 6, verse 8, his response was, Here am I, send me. So how will you respond? Will you be a part of the solution to the problem? God is bringing people into your life, into my life, to help. So we need to help them. We need to give them a reason to take the teachings of Christ seriously. How many people are missing heaven because they aren't even considering the evidence that points to the resurrection? That's right. There is supporting evidence that points to the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and people need to know about it. Today, we're going to look at that evidence. I want to help you to be able to have a conversation with someone about the resurrection of Christ. And there are 3 kinds of evidence that I'd like to share with you. But first, if we want to be used by God, there is an important attitude that needs to become a part of our character. And I'd like to talk to you about it. The attitude that we need to have, the character quality that needs to become a part of our lives, is compassion. A simple definition of compassion is recognizing the needs that others have and being willing to help. The interview with Ace and Betty Draper demonstrate 4 important things that come from a compassionate heart. First, a compassionate person understands that flexibility in life opens doors to be used by God. As you listen to the interview, notice what stage in life they were in when they decided to become a missionary in another country. And notice how often they moved. If you and I want to be used by God, we need to have a flexible attitude towards God rearranging our plans. The plans we've made for how we're going to spend our time and how we're going to spend our money. Flexibility opens doors to be used by God. Number 2, a compassionate person is willing to prepare so that they can be used by God effectively. For example, today we're beginning the preparation for talking with people about the resurrection evidence. A compassionate person understands if they want to be effective, it's a good idea to prepare. Number 3, a compassionate person is sensitive to God burdening their heart so that they can focus their efforts and do well. New Tribes Mission has a focus on reaching a certain group of people, and Ace and Betty found themselves burdened for the same group of people. Be sensitive to the burden that God has placed in your heart. Often, God will use that burden to direct you in how to focus your compassion. And number 4, a compassionate person doesn't just talk about it, they get involved. So as you listen to the interview, notice that the compassionate heart is flexible, it prepares, it has a focus so that it can be effective, and a compassionate heart gets involved. Colossians chapter 3, verse 2 comes to my mind. Set your mind on the things that are above, and not on the things that are on the earth. And so, help us to understand, Betty, about your journey here. How long have you been married to Ace?
We've been married 48 years in October.
And how many years into your marriage was it before one of you sensed the call to leave the United States and go on the mission field?
We were married 24 years and involved in a local church there when God began to work on our hearts about mission. So we'd been married quite a while and had 2 children.
And which one of you first sensed God's call to the mission field?
I would say probably Ace. God worked on Ace's heart first, and I was probably not aware of what was going on other than I knew that God was preparing me for something. There was going to be a change in our life. He had spoke to my heart and had begun to prepare me, and the way he did that was just through New Tribes Mission and literature that we got, exposing me to the fact there were people who had never heard the gospel in their own language, and that spoke to my heart. And I don't think I would have ever said yes to Ace when he said, I think God wants us to go overseas, for any other reason than that reason.
What was the first step that you had to take?
Well, I'll take you back about a year before we actually went. We was exposed to missions in our local church, missionaries coming through, so that always interested us. We wanted to get to know them. But it was through a missionary lady from the Philippines that was working in a tribe teaching literacy. And we were really challenged by that and the needs there for folks to hear. Our first step was just to make an application to New Tribes Mission, and was accepted at that point, and we went off into our first training. So it was about a 2.5-year training time for us.
Where did you do that training at?
Our first training was down in eastern Kentucky, a little place called Cornettsville, and we used to have a training session called a boot camp. We no longer call it that anymore, but it was a time of about 1.5 years of a lot of practical stuff and learning how to live out in the woods and some of those kind of things, and trying to help prepare us for cross-culture living.
When you talk about living out in the woods, that reminds me about the focus of New Tribes Mission when you're going to unreached people groups. Is that the right way to say that? Is that what the focus of New Tribes is?
Yes, we would probably say now the least reached people groups. And the reason they're the least reached is they're very hard to reach. So some of our training early in the mission organization was actually living out in the woods for about 6 weeks and actually trying to experience what it was like to be alone, not being able to go to the store each day. So that was part of our early training.
And Bolivia was the first country you headed to, is that right?
Yes, Bolivia was. After we finished the language school part of our training in Camden to Missouri, the mission leadership asked us if we'd go down to Bolivia, South America, and become part of the support team down there with our mission.
And how many years were you in Bolivia?
We were there 7 years. Both of our kids graduated from the boarding school, so they were exposed to a lot of things that that they would have never thought they would have been exposed to.
How has that impacted your kids, being MKs, missionary kids?
Earlier you had asked me about why New Tribes, and the thing that challenged me with New Tribes early on, as I read the literature and some of the statistics that they published, was that something like 30% of the new missionary candidates that were coming in were missionary kids. So that spoke to me that something that the missionary kids were seeing and experiencing in missions was really impacting their lives, and is wanting to come back and be a part of that. So that really spoke to my heart, having 2 children, and I wanted them to be exposed to missions, and if the Lord led them that way, that they would surrender to that. So that was one of the reasons. We do have a daughter, and her family now are missionaries in Papua New Guinea. Wow. And so they did have an impact on them. And our son's living in California, but it had an impact on him also.
So speaking of Papua New Guinea, that was your next stop. Is that correct? You have 7 years in Bolivia, and then you transitioned to Papua New Guinea?
Well, we came back from Bolivia, South America, and we had our local and sending church asked us if we would stay on staff there for a couple of years.
Okay.
So we did that for a couple of years. We stepped out of the mission organization and stayed for a couple of years, and then the Lord directed us differently. And as we came back in and made an application again to come into New Tribes Mission, the direction was then to go to Papua New Guinea for a need over in that area. Mm-hmm.
Tell us a little bit about the ministry in Papua New Guinea.
Well, the one thing that stands out to me the most is the difference between living in Bolivia, where we lived. It was a high desert. The weather was very, very nice. When we went to Papua New Guinea, we lived right on the ocean, and it was very hot and humid and tropical, and that was very difficult to get used to.
So missionaries with New Tribes, they're actually, maybe you can tell us the steps for this, but they're going into the jungle to a people group, and they're introducing them to the concept of a one true God, and then helping them to understand the Bible, and then eventually Jesus Christ and the gospel.
Yeah, that's correct.
Is that right? Okay.
Yeah, we're looking. Our mission purpose is really to assist the local church to carry out the command of going to all the world and preach the gospel. And as I said earlier, that it's the least reached people groups that we're interested in and going. And as God leads us to these different parts of the world, then as we make these assessments, if we determine that in that area, if they are the least reached, then a team is put together. And we'd love to have 3 families to join a team and go in and to learn the language and the culture, with eventually teaching the Bible and presenting the gospel.
Now, earlier we were talking about assessing where you're going to go, assessing the people group. How does that work? We're using airplanes and canoes and...
Yeah, we use all of those modes of transportation, canoes, helicopters, airplanes, and we're trying to get into the closest airstrip, or if there's a river that's close to it. Sometimes we use the helicopter to go in. And we're looking for language groups that have not heard the gospel message, for sure, and there's not other groups nearby that they would get to them. So we're looking at them as, if we don't go in there, they're probably will not be reached with the gospel. So our goal is to get in there and assess them, what the needs are. Do we have an invitation from them? That's a question we have to find out. So we look and see what the needs are and where we could locate, the most strategic place to locate.
So when you go into the jungle to this new people group, where do you start? I mean, I guess there's a point at which someone's got to learn the language, and how long does that relationship take to develop before you actually begin to talk about something that's going to lead them to the gospel?
Well, from the very beginning, the first visit into the location, we would say you begin to build a relationship. You begin to build a relationship with the people, and with the goal of learning the language and the culture, so that eventually you can be able to understand them, what they're thinking, their worldview. And as you begin to write the Bible lessons and translate the scriptures, that would be the goal.
Ace just said 2 very important things that we need to be thinking about as we begin to talk about evangelism and the evidence for the resurrection. And by the way, there is more to come from Ace and Betty in the next episode. But first, the first thing that Ace said.
Well, from the very beginning, the first visit into the location, we would say you begin to build a relationship. You begin to build a relationship with the people, and with the goal of learning the language and the culture.
This is so important. If you and I want to be used by God in evangelism, it is important that we do not shy away from building relationships with people that are not Christians. Some Christians have the idea that they don't want to associate with anybody but Christians. But if you want to be used by God, that's not the approach to take. And while we're building these relationships, we need to pay close attention to the second thing that Ace says. Listen to this.
So that eventually you can be able to understand them, what they're thinking, their worldview.
As we're building a relationship with someone, it's important to pay attention to their worldview. So as we're thinking about this first kind of evidence for the resurrection, it's important to recognize that most people are not thinking, well, of course there's historical evidence for the resurrection. It's in the Bible, and the Bible is not just a religious book, but it's also an accurate book. No, most people are not thinking that way. That idea is not a part of their worldview. This first kind of evidence is the evidence that gets its facts from historical documents. There are people who don't believe that Christ ever existed, and there are others who believe that he existed, but that he never rose from the dead. Well, we're going to look at supporting evidence for each of these. These historical documents are not the books of the Bible. The historical kind of evidence that I'll be talking about is the kind of evidence that would be considered by someone who has a non-Christian worldview. The documents come from 6 different people, and here they are. First, a Roman historian and a Jewish historian of the 1st and 2nd centuries, and then a Roman governor of the 2nd century. After that, We have a well-known Greek philosopher of the 2nd century, and then a popular Greek playwright of the 2nd century. And person number 6 is a well-respected archaeologist of the 20th century. So let's get started here. First, we're going to look at the Roman historian. He wrote about the death of Christ. His name was Tacitus. He was a 1st and 2nd century Roman historian and a senator, and he mentions that Christ was the founder of Christianity and was put to death by Pontius Pilate. The original manuscript doesn't exist anymore, but a copy of the original is kept in a monastery about 80 miles southeast of Rome, Italy. And from his writings, there is supporting evidence for these 3 facts. First, the fact that Christ existed. Second, the fact that the Bible's account of Pontius Pilate sentencing Christ to death is true. And third, the fact that there were people of the day who believed that Christ had risen. The historian records the fact that Christ was the founder of Christianity, and Christianity, of course, is based on the resurrection. The second person was a Jewish historian who lived in Rome. His name was Josephus, and he had a 20-volume work on Jewish history written in AD 93 and 94, and he references Christ 2 times in books number 18 and books number 20. His most detailed paragraph about Christ was debated for many years. People wondered if Christians had actually changed some of it around to make it sound better. But in 1995, new evidence was discovered that gave clarification to which part of Josephus' works were original and which was embellished by some transcribers. So after scholars determined what part was authentic and what part was embellished, here is what we learn from the Jewish historian Josephus. From his works, there is supporting evidence for 6 facts. First, that Jesus existed. Second, that he was a wise man and performed some amazing things. Third, that he was a teacher with followers among the Jews and the Greeks. Fourth, that he was accused by Jewish leaders. 5, that he was condemned to crucifixion by Pilate. And number 6, on the 3rd day, he appeared to his followers. And so those are the first 2 people that provide supporting evidence for the existence of Christ and the resurrection. And then as you saw with Josephus, several more details about Christ. Number 3 is a Roman governor who wanted to crush Christianity. His name was Pliny the Younger, spelled Pliny, Pliny the Younger, and he wrote hundreds of letters, and many of them still exist. The letter that mentions Christ was written around 112 AD to the emperor of the day. And in the letter, the governor is asking the emperor how to deal with the Christians. In the writings back and forth, the governor nor the emperor mention the crimes that the Christians have committed, except for being a Christian. The governor states that he gives Christians multiple chances to affirm that they are innocent, and if they refuse 3 times, then they're executed. Pliny states that his investigations have revealed nothing on the Christians' part but harmless practices and what he calls depraved, excessive superstition. However, the governor seems concerned about the rapid spread of the superstition. And basically, he calls it a superstition instead of a religion because they are not worshiping a state-approved God. The governor then details the practices of Christians, and he says that they meet on a certain day before light, where they gather and they sing hymns to Christ as to a God. Well, there are other interesting details in this letter that you can read in the show notes on my website. But the main thing that you and I need to know is that this letter provides supporting evidence for 2 important facts. The first fact is that Christ existed. And the second fact is that there were people of that day who believed that Christ had risen from the dead. And we know this from his letter because it says that they were worshiping him. By the way, these people lived close to the time when Christ was crucified. Scholars think Christ was crucified around 33 or 34 AD. This letter was written in 112 AD. That's about 80 years after the crucifixion. And this is important because we're not talking about people who became Christians because of stories about the resurrection being passed down over 1,000 or 2,000 years. And we aren't talking about people who became believers because of stories being passed down over even a few hundred years. Instead, We're talking about stories of the resurrection that were being passed down within the last 80 years. Do you know what this means? It means that some of the stories about a risen Christ were being told by elderly men and women who may have actually seen Jesus themselves when they were kids. It means that many of these Christians had heard about the resurrection from their parents. They heard it from their mom and dad who were alive when Jesus was alive. Imagine hearing from your mom or dad firsthand information about what Jesus was like. You see, the fact that these historical documents are about believers from the 1st and 2nd centuries make this kind of evidence extremely reliable evidence. In a court of law, eyewitness testimony is very credible, and that's what we're talking about. Eyewitness testimony from a mom and dad telling their kids about Jesus. It cannot be denied that there were people convinced that the resurrection was indeed a fact, and this Roman governor knew they were convinced. The fact that people believed in the resurrection is not just in the Bible. I think that many of the people of our day who are denying the fact that the resurrection actually happened are not considering the fact that there is reliable testimony from people who were living much closer to the situation, much closer to the time period. And so we had two historians. We had a Roman historian and a Jewish historian. And then we had a Roman governor. Now I'd like to introduce you to a well-known Greek philosopher. His name was Celsus, spelled C-E-L-S-U-S. Some think that he may have even been Roman. He lived during the 2nd century. Perhaps he was Greek and he also lived in Rome. He wrote a book called The True Word. Some call it The True Discourse, and it was a book attacking Christianity. As a philosopher and a writer, Celsus did his best to destroy Christianity, and he went to great lengths to discredit Christ and the miracles of Christ. But one thing he never did was deny the existence of Christ. In his writings, he didn't act as though Jesus was a myth, but rather he tried to explain why Jesus could not be divine. He never even denied the miracles of Jesus, but instead he tried to explain them away as some sort of magic. The writings of this 2nd century Greek philosopher provide supporting evidence for three important facts. 1, the fact that Christ existed. 2, the fact that Christ did some amazing things. And 3, the fact that there were people who believed in a resurrected Christ. And again, one of the reasons that this is great supporting evidence is because it's talking about people who believed in the resurrection, who lived so close to the time period of the resurrection. Number 5 is a popular Greek playwright of the 2nd century who made fun of Christians. His name was Lucian, spelled L-U-C-I-A-N. He was born in Turkey, and he traveled around doing public speaking events and later settled down in Athens, Greece, and became a popular playwright of satire. Now, in case you aren't familiar with the term, satire just means to use humor or exaggeration to criticize people. Well, Lucian, he made a career out of this. And in one of his writings, he makes fun of Christians because of two things. First, they worship a man who was crucified. And the second reason he makes fun is because they believe that they all become brothers immediately upon conversion. The supporting evidence that comes from this popular Greek playwright supports these three facts. First, the fact that Jesus existed. He talks about the Christians worshiping a man who had been crucified. Obviously, this was Jesus. The second fact is the fact that Jesus was crucified. It was common knowledge of the day, and Lucian talks about it. And the third fact is the fact that people believed that Jesus was alive. Listen to this. Lucian says that they worshiped a man who was crucified. This confirms that these people believed that he was alive. So all of the people we've talked about up until now are from the 1st and 2nd century. We had the Roman historian and the Jewish historian. And then we had the Roman governor. And then the well-known Greek philosopher. And then the popular Greek playwright. Well, the sixth person that we're going to talk about is one of the greatest archaeologists who ever lived. He was from Scotland, and his name was Sir William Mitchell Ramsey. He lived from 1851 to 1939. But this man was not just any archaeologist. He was regarded as one of the greatest who ever lived. You can read about his education in Wikipedia through one of the links in my show notes. He was a very smart man, but some of his education was at a liberal university in Germany. And from that experience, he began to doubt the reliability of the New Testament. But things began to change as he did some traveling into the very areas where the early church history took place. He investigated the geographical and cultural details of the book of Acts by actually going to the places that Acts mentions. And as he checked out the details of the book, he began to have a greater respect for the author of the book, whose name was Luke. Luke, of course, wrote one of the Gospels, which told about the resurrection. Luke was also a companion of the Apostle Paul in his travels. So what did the great archaeologist conclude? Well, in 1914, he wrote a 400-plus page book called The Bearing of Recent Discovery on the Trustworthiness of the New Testament. I actually downloaded this book off the internet, and you can do the same thing. On page 89, regarding Luke's accuracy, he says, "You may press the words of Luke in a degree beyond any other historians, and they stand the keenest scrutiny and the hardest treatment." On page 222, he said, "Luke is a historian of the first rank." Sir William goes on to tell us that Luke's statements of fact are trustworthy. And then he says this about Luke. He says Luke should be placed along with the very greatest of historians. What you and I need to understand is this. This very respected Scottish archaeologist has told us something important about the same man who also wrote about the resurrection. What we know is that Luke had a tremendous commitment to accuracy, a commitment to truth. We can trust Luke. In fact, the famous archaeologist actually writes specifically about trusting Luke on page 81. He says this. He says that Luke's history is unsurpassed in respect of its trustworthiness. So from this well-respected archaeologist from Scotland, who published his work in the 20th century, we find supporting evidence for three important facts. Fact number one, Luke was a historian. Fact number two, the very detailed information that has been recorded about the resurrection was written down by an excellent historian. Not just any historian. This is an excellent historian. He is very impressed with Luke. And fact number three is this. It's the fact that this historian has been checked out and found to be committed to accuracy and is considered trustworthy. Now, the reason this is an important fact is because it vouches for Luke's character. You have a world-renowned archaeologist of his day staking his reputation on the assessment of Luke's work and Luke's character. And it's this historian named Luke who writes about a very real resurrection, not a figurative resurrection, but a literal resurrection. In Acts chapter 1, Luke talks about it some more, giving a short review of what happened, and then he talks about how Jesus appeared to many different people over the course of 40 days before going to heaven. When you and I talk with someone about the gospel, it's important to help them to understand that there is strong evidence that the resurrection was a reality. People around us are deceived into thinking it was just a myth. But if you and I can talk about the evidence that gets its facts from historical documents, then we can help people to begin to think seriously about Christ. Sure, some people will still reject him. You can count on that. But some will get saved. People all over the world come to Christ when they realize that he truly was the Son of God. I want to encourage you to take the time and review this evidence so that you can have a conversation with someone about it. We have the two historians, the Roman and the Jewish historian, and then we have the Roman governor, then the Greek philosopher and the Greek playwright, and then the Scottish archaeologist. These are the facts. With humility and with gentleness, share the evidence that gets its facts from historical documents. You can find the notes for today's podcast by going to wordoutreach.org/3, as in episode 3. There you will find the links for the evidence that I spoke about today, as well as a link for Ace and Betty Draper with New Tribes Mission. Next time, I'm planning on looking at that second kind of evidence. It's the evidence that gets in the way of other explanations. Hey, thanks for being here today. I really appreciate you making time in your schedule.